someone once said to me that innovation is working within constraints, and I was going to have one of these little mics up here, and then we had problems with the mics and the feedback. So I've been given this mic, and normally I wave my arms around, so I'm going to be a bit like this. It's interesting how the brain works. Has that suddenly stopped working? There it goes. You see, we've already got problems. How the brain works, because the first gig I ever went to was here in Bradford. I went to see the Stranglers at St George's Hall. It's one of the best gigs I've ever went to. And as well, and here I am with a microphone on stage in Bradford, and I've got one of these kind of sort of unit things here I look at and suddenly find myself wanting to put my foot up or something like that, you know. So, but also, as I get up here, I realise I've got a real problem with the main tool I'm going to use here, which is my voice, right? Because my accent's suddenly going all over the place. Because I was born just outside Bradford in a town called Keighley. And I've also just been thrown by speaking to Stephen, who tells me that Keighley is the serial killer capital of the UK, which I didn't know. You know, and just as I was wanting to concentrate, my brain's going off with that. Like, apparently 3 of the country's greatest serial killers are from there. And I'm like, which ones, you know? But anyway, I'm not one of them, so that's the main thing you need to know. And the reason my accents are kind of a bit all over the place is because I was born in Keighley because my parents lived in the Yorkshire Dales. The Yorkshire Dales is full of sheep, which is where all the wool came from that came into Bradford. My mum was a social worker in Bradford as well, so I spent some time in Bradford with her when I was younger. I then moved down to London. I spent a protracted period of time outside the country. I lived in Australia, where everything goes up at the end of the accent. I then lived in Indonesia, where everything's sort of sing-song. And it was particularly interesting at the start of today when people were talking about the sort of being a British Muslim. Because living in Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. It's a democracy. Over half the population are under the age of 25. So there's kind of some sort of similarities. But it was interesting for me being a white English-speaking person in a country like that, because they've got a word for us, which is bule. And bule means kind of white man. And people would chase me around saying, bule, bule. And I was never sure if they were kind of like taking the mickey out of me or they were happy to see me, but it was an interesting kind of experience. But the reason I went there was because about 10 years ago, I set off on a journey, which to some extent I'm still on. I was interested in how the world was changing. I was particularly interested as someone who was very much born out of the digital era. My early career was working in all things digital. I was particularly interested in the emergence of some new companies and organizations that seem to be exploding in terms of their growth. It started with Google, and then there was kind of YouTube, and then we had Facebook, and we had all these kind of new kind of organizations, and their growth was extraordinary. They seemed to be organized in a different way to other organizations. So initially, that was what I was interested in, finding out about that. And off I went, and it's why I wanted to go to some different countries, and particularly my time in Indonesia was very sort of instructive to see a fledgling nation. We're pretty obsessed over here in the northeast sort of quadrant of the world map with ourselves, and it was interesting to be in Asia, where there's a very different vibe, you know, where a lot of people are being lifted out of poverty, where there's a lot of enlightenment occurring because of the internet and the availability of information, and that's when I began to realize that something like Google, for me, is a social innovation. You know, what Google allows people to do is actually, find information, see information online that in cultures where previously they wouldn't be able to do that. So that kind of got me interested in what was going on. So that's kind of what led me here, I suppose, today. And we've heard a lot of the themes that I'm going to talk about. So I'm glad I'm in the right place. We've heard about belonging. And I think that's something I'm going to talk about. We've heard about different versions of the word participation. We've heard about purpose and meaning. And we particularly heard about connection. We've also heard that people talking about the impact of technology, which is interesting. And I've been talking for the last few years, going to sort of forums like this and talking to people, and I kind of get sort of feedback. And there's two bits of feedback I get. One of them is from younger people, young people being like under 40, right? And they're like, how do we make the world work? You know, that's what we're interested in. How on earth do we make the world work? And the older people, all they say is robots. That's it. They like robots. And I'm like, what about robots? He said, are the robots coming? They're obsessed with robots. I don't know why that is, right? But once you start to look into that a little bit, you realize it's, what people are worried about is an existential risk, right? They're not really interested in robots. They're interested in things that are going to, in some way, influence us humanity. So I wanted to do a little social experiment for you that you can do while we're here, right? So this is interactive, which is a definition of a cyborg. If you look up a definition of cyborg, a cyborg is a human being augmented with some technology that he can't live without. So it's a challenge. I'd like to try turning off your mobile phones. Turn off your mobile phones for the whole of today. And what we will do, we will tweet from TEDxBradford the effect of that, right? See how you go with it. See how you survive. See if you can do it. And I've said this to other people, and I love this. What happens, just so you know how kind of a room like this works, is you kind of get all the keen people around the front, right? And the keen people are all like this. And when I say this, they all start to get really jittery, right? So maybe try it out, right? Because maybe the cyborgs are already among us. So, what was I going to say next? I got caught up in myself there. So, in terms of social change, we've heard a lot about the sort of negative impacts and the kind of worry. And I think there's one thing at the moment we could say is that people are kind of worried. As we're talking, yesterday night the British government had a vote about Brexit. It was thrown out. It was the largest vote against a government ever in British history, right? And it's easy to get caught up in our little world, but if you look over to America, you've got the shutdown of the American government, which is extraordinary. It's a bit like going into work and the leadership team of work saying, we're just giving up. We're just not doing anything for a while, right? That's essentially what's happened in the most powerful nation on the planet. If you look over in France, there's civil unrest, which is beginning to escalate, and you've also got a country where in the last general election, a third of the population voted for a far-right organisation. And as you look all the way across Europe and across the Northern Hemisphere, you begin to see these kind of tectonic changes, right? So something's kind of going on, right? But it's very easy to get caught up in all that. So I just wanted to tell you one little story, which is interesting because it's kind of about Bradford. If you go back about 200 years to the Industrial Revolution, things looked very similar in the second decade of the 1800s as they do in the second decade of this century, right? What you saw was the emergence of this extraordinary new technology, which was creating an explosion of opportunities, but also kind of putting people out of work. You saw the sudden inequality of wealth, a lot of people becoming an awful lot poorer with a very small number of people becoming richer. You saw civil unrest, you saw political turmoil, the political system no longer seeming to work, and you actually had the most powerful man in the world, who at that point was the King of England, was about as popular as Donald Trump, right? So it's kind of very, very, very similar to what's going on now. And in 1811, a group of social activists gathered in a place called Arnold in Nottingham, and they marched to the town, and they were worried about their jobs. They were worried that their jobs were being mechanised, were being taken away. They were moving from salary jobs to zero-hour contracts. And as they marched, people joined them, and it turned into an incredibly sort of successful rally in some ways, and also a kind of violent rally, and that kind of violence and civil unrest spread all the way around the country. And to this day, it's still the biggest period of civil unrest this country has ever had. It nearly brought down the government. It kind of nearly brought down the whole kind of country. Now, those people today, we would call them social activists. But when we look back, we call those people the Luddites. Because those people are now seen as people who are resistant to change. And at the time, all they were doing was fighting for what they thought was right, fighting for social change, fighting for their livelihoods and their jobs. So what was missing? Why were they doing that, And the reason was because they couldn't see the future. They couldn't see, if you look ahead, the future, and part of that future was Bradford. Because at that time, Bradford was not really a city, and it wasn't until mechanisation came along and the woolen mills were created that Bradford, in the second part of the 19th century, became this kind of powerhouse, 200 mills. The richest city in the British Empire at one point was here in Bradford, right? They couldn't see that. They couldn't see electric lighting. They couldn't see plumbing. They couldn't see urbanisation. They couldn't see the railway system. They couldn't see the development of the internal combustion engine, medicine, psychology. They couldn't see any of that, which came in the second part of the 19th century, the abolition of slavery, the birth of democracy. And it was 90 years before penicillin was created. So at the time, they were resisting change, right? So one of the things I'd like to say to you is to consider that resistance to change is futile, which is why I like that quote from John Kabat Zin, which is, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf, right? And that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. I'm going to give you a very quick model, right, that normally takes me kind of weeks to go through with organizations. I'm going to give it to you in about 5 minutes, so I'm just going to kind of rush through it. But I'm going to give you a model because the problem we have at the moment, there's a lovely line in the Bible, actually, in Proverbs, which says, where there is no vision, the people perish, right? And what at the moment is we don't have a vision. We don't have a vision for a collective future as a world, as Europe, as a country, right? And so we're caught up in our kind of circumstances. And when you have no map, it's very difficult to know where you're going. Now, what I'm not going to try and do is be a futurist and say how I think the future's going to go. As human beings, we tend to look at the future of either utopian or dystopian. And in reality, it turns out a bit of both and somewhere in between. So I don't know how it's going to turn out, but what I can do, I'm going to give you a model to work from. Because the way you navigate is you triangulate, right, between three things. I'm going to give you 3 things that you can use as a model, and then I'm going to talk about what we might do with it, right? So I've called this talk The Life and Death of Everything Now, because really what's happening is we're going through a social transformation, an economic transformation. And why it's so awkward is when transformation happens, something's dying while something is emerging at the same time. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in our economy. We're actually moving from a consumer economy to a different kind of economy, what I like to call a social economic economy, but that's just the kind of language I use. And that's why it's kind of awkward, right? So what's happening is everything is dying, everything is emerging at the same time, and it's kind of happening right now. So what I'm interested in, what I'm going to talk to you about is what is emerging, because I think that's a better place to look. So innovation happens very much on the kind of the field of play. And when I offered to do this talk, I got excited about it, I planned it, and then a couple of days ago I rang up Imran and said, I need a whiteboard. I always work on a whiteboard. He says, we haven't got a whiteboard. And I'm like, okay, don't worry about that. I've got a little portable thing I can stick on the wall. He goes, we don't have walls you can stick things on. So I'm like, damn it. And one thing I found, and I write about in my book actually, is that an awful lot of great things start in coffee shops. So I live in Colchester in Essex, and I went to my local coffee shop to kind of think about it. And here's my cup of coffee. And I wondered what that thing was in the left-hand corner, right? And I found out it was, I found out it was this. It was chalk. And I realized that the table was a blackboard. So I decided to kind of map out my talk. If any of you are involved in sort of particularly digital innovation, there's this thing called Agile, right? Agile is like a new methodology. It's not new at all, but it's become like it's all the rage. It's a way of developing software. I'm a great fan of it. And in Agile, they talk about a minimal viable product, right? Which is get something out that's just good enough. And I think that's what I've done here. I took it with my iPhone, and so I'm going to kind of give you an analog digital experience, right? So I'm a business consultant by job, and business consultants only have 2 models. They're either triangles or they're Venn diagrams. Actually, it's 3 models. It's also a quadrant. That's all we use. Those are our tools. So I'm going to give you a Venn diagram. I'm going to talk about sort of three things. So 3 things that distinguish. Actually, before I do that, I've got a question. I don't have a lot of time. So I want to do a kind of quick vote, which is I can talk to you about how to change the world. I can talk to you about how to have a better life and be happy. Or I can talk to you about how to make a shed load of cash. Which one are you interested in? All right, so just quick vote. Right, like the first one, how to change the world. Oh, that's pretty good. That's about a third. How to be happy and have a good life. And how to make a shed load of cash. People want to put their hand up. We're back to this kind of situation again. I was telling you about how the room kind of works. And I work in rooms a lot. And what happens is that you have the keen people here, right? And then you have the kind of cynical people at the back, the ones that are a bit kind of cool. If you could still smoke, they'd be smoking. And normally down the edges, you have what I call the millennial disease, which are those that kind of, well, I'm here, but I might not be here. I might get a date on Tinder. So, I might leave and I might not. I just don't know. I don't know about anything, right? But I think those are kind of down the aisles today. And then in the middle, you have the Stoics, and they're the people who just kind of sit there. It's like, I'm just not going to do anything, right, sort of thing. And it's interesting, the ripple there was down the edges kind of thing. So, so what was the will of the people there? Well, we probably had about 40-40-20. So what should I talk about? How to make money, or I like you people at the front, you see, it's the front people, they're the keen ones. The good news is I'm going to talk about all 3. And one of the things I want to talk about is how I think all 3 are intertwined. And certainly when it comes to kind of social innovation, we need to kind of get rid of a view that social innovation needs to be small and that social innovation can't be profitable. I do some teaching at the at Cambridge University Centre for Social Innovation. They have a master's degree there. And there's a guy there, an American, he's a Republican. And he's involved in social innovation in Asia. It's quite interesting because people often tend to be more left-leaning. And he has this line, he says, if you want to do good, you've got to do well, right? So it's something I'm going to talk about, how these 3 things work together. So what's the first part of this model, right? What's this kind of first circle? It's about purpose, right? And this word is loaded at the moment. What does the word purpose mean? So I'm going to give you a very, very quick little example, which is I got very interested in Instagram. Instagram was one of those organizations that came from nowhere. It went from a startup to a $1 billion sellout in 22 months. It went from no users to 250 million users in 22 months. It's an extraordinary kind of story. But what I was particularly interested in was also the story of Kodak, right? Because Kodak are a 20th century organization. I mean, they came out of the 19th century, but they were really successful in the 20th century. In 1975, a young engineer at Kodak called Stephen Sasson invented digital photography, right? 1975. And at the time, Kodak weren't very interested because they're a film company, but they kind of patented it and they hung on to the patent. 1997, Kodak owned 70% of the world's imagery market. They were the 6th most valuable brand in the world. 2010, Instagram started. 2 guys in some kind of place in San Francisco. 22 months later, they were bought by Facebook for $1 billion because they had 250 million users. In the same month, Kodak went out of business. So the question is, why couldn't Kodak create Instagram? And it comes down to this interesting word, purpose. And what do we mean by purpose? Because purpose quite often gets appropriated to mean doing good. And I think purpose is often doing good. But if you look at what, I think it's called Mike Systrom and Kevin, someone or other, from Instagram did, they were 24 and 27, is what they did is they looked at Kodak and they went back to what Kodak's original purpose was. And Kodak's original purpose wasn't film and film stock. There's a guy called George Eastman, who at the time himself was only 24 years old. And what Eastman was interested in was capturing and sharing experiences with other people. That was the purpose of Kodak. And Kodak forgot that, like many organizations. They moved from why they did what they did, which is their purpose, to what they did, which became about film and film stock. And once they got caught up in that, that's what they thought they were. So what Instagram did, it went back to that fundamental social purpose because it was a social purpose. It was a social innovation, which is how do you share your experiences with other people? And they used the technology that was available to them, which was an iPhone. Now, once you start to look at high-growth organizations in this kind of new emerging economic paradigm, what you see is that that's where they all start. They all start with purpose. And I think it's an interesting place to look from because it's a social mission. Google wasn't a search engine when it set off. They had a search engine, but their purpose was to make the world's information available and accessible to all. When you look at Tesla, Tesla's social purpose, Tesla's mission, is to accelerate the world's move to sustainable energy. It doesn't mention cars and it doesn't mention batteries. And particularly at a time of great change, why coming from a purpose rather than what in business terms is called a positioning, which is what you do, is important, is because things are moving so quickly. If you get attached to what you do, you get left behind. If you stay true to why you do what you do, you can innovate. And I think it's a great starting point for particularly here, where I imagine there's a lot of people interested in social innovation. The second trig point, if you like, to think from is something I'm really, really interested in one of my books called The Participation Revolution, is that we're moving from an economy in the 20th century that was based on passive consumption to an economy that's based on active participation. It's really, really subtle and it's really, really profound. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the great companies of the 20th century, oil companies, they found oil and they sold oil. Film companies made films. Car companies made cars. That's what they did. They made things, right? They made things and they sold them to us. If you look at the high-growth organizations of this century, they don't make anything. If you look at Uber, Uber doesn't have any cars. What it does is it allows other people to participate in ride-sharing. Airbnb doesn't actually have any hotels. It allows other people to participate. What Google does, it doesn't have any information. It doesn't have any content. It allows us to participate in life by finding what we want, by connecting to people, to places, and things. And once you actually start to look at what's happening, is we're shifting to a model where people were interested in consuming to a model where people are interested in being actively involved, which is why it's a participatory revolution. The kind of high growth things that people are interested in now, if you look at what's happening with yoga, if you look at what's happening with road cycling, people want to be involved in things where they're kind of doing things. And you're seeing it in politics too, which is why there's such a problem going on for traditional political parties. Because people no longer want to be ruled by a top-down kind of elite. They want to be involved, which is why you're seeing the emergence of political movements. And at the moment, we're in a really interesting place where our political system is literally beginning to crack open. I don't want to get into the B word, to the Brexit word, right? Because that just opens up a kind of can of worms. But all I could say is, as far as I can see, Brexit's pretty much splits the country 50-50. I mean, you can quibble about numbers, right? And at the moment, there isn't a political party representing 50% of the country. No major party. That is a problem, okay? So how do we create a new form of participatory politics? That's a kind of interesting question. And the third thing is belonging. And we've heard people talk about that. And as social innovators, I think this is particularly important. One of the stories I like was about another two 20-something guys in New York, a guy called Adam Newstrom and Miguel Fitzkelvic, I think he's called. Adam was from a kibbutz. Miguel was from a commune, and they were designers, and in 2008 they created a shared working space, pretty much like we've been talking about, right, that allowed people to kind of start up. It's called Green Space, and it was Williamsburg in New York. And it's pretty successful. And in 2010 they sold it and they decided to make a bigger model, and the bigger model they called WeWork. And WeWork is a shared space where people can come along, they can congregate, they can buy spaces however they want, and a really big part of WeWork isn't just office space, it's about feeling part of something and belonging. And over the next few years, WeWork has expanded, it's now in 100 countries, it's got 500 locations, and it's worth $46 billion. Why? Because we want to belong and we want to feel part of something. And at the moment, we've got an identity war going on in our world, and we're all struggling to find out quite where we fit in. So this is kind of the landscape, right, in terms of high growth organizations. And I'm thinking from a commercial point of view, because you talked about wanting to make money. But let's move it to the personal, right? Take you through this kind of quickly. When we have purpose in our lives and we have a sense of belonging, so in other words, we've got a crowd, we've got a tribe we're running with, but we now have no ability to participate, we're frustrated. And I'd say that's what's happening to a lot of people at the moment. We really want to change the world. We want to make the world better. We want to make our country better. We've got people like us, and particularly if you're on social media, more and more the algorithms will be finding them for you, you know? And they're telling you over and over again the same thing. This is bad, this is bad, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is need fixing. We know that the problem is, but we don't have a solution because we can't participate, so we end up frustrated. Where we have the ability to participate and belong, but no sense of purpose, life occurs as toil. And an incredible statistic that came out of the United States quite recently is 50%, or just short of 50% of American workers think that their jobs are superfluous. It's not just that their jobs are boring, but actually they think their job doesn't contribute to society at all. Now think about that in terms of wasted human potential, right? When we don't have a sense of purpose, life occurs as toil. And particularly crucially, when we have purpose and participation, but no sense of belonging, we feel lonely. And there's an epidemic of loneliness at the moment. Some interesting statistics. I just talked about America. America contributes 6% of the world's population, but 24% of the world's GDP. It also has 24% of the world's prison population and 24% of the world's opioid abuse. About 40,000 people get killed with handguns in America every year. We kind of know all about that kind of stuff watching on TV, but 60% of those are suicides. Something's going on. And if you move to this country, one man every 2 hours kills himself. It's the biggest killer of men under the age of 50 in the United Kingdom. You know, when we're looking at all the things we should get involved with, you know, sorting cancer and heart disease, all good things. But suicide is the biggest killer of men under the age of 50 in this country. There's something we need to do about that. A statistic from the National Health Service that 1 in 4 women between the age of 15 and 25 self-harm, and 1 in 10 exhibit the symptoms of profound post-traumatic stress disorder. So something's going on in our society. Something's kind of going missing, you know, and as social innovators, I think that's something to kind of get really interested in. So we'll kind of move down a level from that, right? So we get down to when all 3 of them are there, this really interesting word, and we can feel it in the room today, is when all 3 are there, this word we've heard about before, connection, but I like to use the word deep connection, because connection sometimes gets confused. It gets confused with connectivity, being online or something like that. But this really odd thing, which I think is going to be the currency of our new economy, which is connection. Connection is the currency, but that's social connection. It's something we know when it's there, and we know when it's not there. But it's really difficult to put your finger on what it is. And in that is all sorts of different interpretations. It was really great to hear about the projects, the first projects around the British Muslim community. You know, it depends very much on your belief on what connection means for you. For some people, it is connection to the divine. For some people, it's connection to the self. Some people, it's connection to humanity. It is a belief system, but I think it manifests in people always the same, which is this idea that I'm not on my own, that I feel okay and I'm connected to something greater than myself. And I think that's what we're looking for. And that really is the thing for us all to work on. When I go into organizations, when it's there, people are happy and they're high-performing organizations. When it's not, they're not. It's kind of that simple. But you're interested in being happy as well. So let me take it down to another level. Let's look at the neuroscience of this. And then it gets kind of really interesting. How your brain works. Your brain feeds you hormones. This is kind of what we're kind of drug addicts in a way. We're kind of addicted to these kind of drugs, right? But they're good drugs, right? When you have a sense of purpose, something that's meaningful to you, something that you can actually sort of like attach yourself to, we produce something called dopamine. Dopamine is a happy drug, right? And when we don't have dopamine, we tend to try and find other places to find dopamine. You know, it's one of the reasons people are interested in sugar and chocolate and coffee and all these kind of things is because they help us produce dopamine. So when we have a sense of purpose, we create dopamine. When we're participating in something that we find interesting, a game worth playing, where we're striving and we're achieving, we produce serotonin, another happy drug. And what's particularly interesting, when we have a sense of belonging, when we feel connected to other human beings, we produce something called oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone of connection, right? It's what babies need to feel when they're born. If a baby's born and doesn't actually feel a connection for whatever reason, it doesn't create oxytocin and often struggles, right, throughout life. So these are the three things at a human level we're interested in, and it comes from this trifecta of purpose, participation, and belonging. And what's interesting, when I was a kid, my mum was a social worker in Bradford, and I remember late 70s, 80s coming to Bradford. And Bradford was a dangerous time then, and my brother was reminding me the social work offices used to have kind of cages over the desks because people were so worried about being attacked. And I would have a social worker called these days as this happened, but my mum used to put me in the car. I was 10 years old, and we used to drive around these estates, And looking back now, with a bit more knowledge, I'd say what has happened is communities, where the community broke down, where people didn't have jobs, people didn't have purpose, they didn't have the ability to participate, was all these things had disappeared, connection had disappeared. And what's interesting is where you see that social breakdown, you see an opioid drug that people are becoming increasingly addicted to, which is called OxyContin. And it's really interesting that where there is no oxytocin, OxyContin shows up, which is an opiate, right? Which is a bit like heroin. So I'm particularly interested as well, if you look at some of the social innovations going on around the world with addiction. In Portugal, they've realized that addiction isn't about drugs, it's about a lack of social connection. And they're starting to do recovery programs, which is about rehabilitating people back into the community. In Glasgow, they've decided to distinguish, what's that say? Okay, I got to finish. How long have I got? Okay. In Glasgow, they talk about violent crime now as a disease. And the way they're actually treating that now, again, is to bring people back into the community. So I'm kind of going to leave you with this model. But one thing particularly, right? I'll move through this a little bit swiftly. We won't do any of that, right? But if you want to do something, if you want to create something, how do we turn this into kind of a manifesto? And really the first thing is to create a cause. If you're interested in what should I do, create a cause, something that's got a social purpose where you're actually doing something that's meaningful and matters to you, to mobilize a movement, and that's about participation. It's no longer about you doing things on your own. How do you get people involved to build a community? And if you do those three things, what I'm interested in is then I think we'll have a world that works. So thank you very much.